On the other side of the globe, we also have civilizations in the Americas. And the two big ones are ones that you have heard about before. They're going to be the Aztecs and the Incan Empire. So I don't want to take a ton of time with these guys. We'll definitely touch base on them in the next chapter as soon as the Europeans show up and just completely like rape and pillage and destroy their entire complex society. But for the Aztecs, just to start off with here, again, make sure you're highlighting what I highlight, and I'll tell you what to add a handful of notes here. So that the Mexica were a semi-nomadic people who migrated southward from northern Mexico. What allows the Aztec Empire to actually take place and actually create is something known as the Triple Alliance, where the Mexica and two other city states are going to unite. Once this occurs, then they're going to be able to launch a program of military conquest. And they're going to conquer much of Mesoamerica in under a century. So these guys are very, very motivated expanders of their territory and conquerors. The thing here is with the Aztec Empire, because it is developed so quickly, the Aztec Empire ends up just being a very loosely structured, unstable conquest state. So, unfortunately, what it also means for them is once the Europeans show up, they don't necessarily have the internal stability, the structure to deal with these guys coming in. I mean, they have been all about going and building an empire and expanding, but haven't necessarily sat down and really created any clear cut, overwhelming bureaucratic structure. Even though it's very unstable and loosely structured, these guys are still a substantial empire. I mean, we have a population of 5 to 6 million. They do have an internal economic support system where the conquered people pay regular tribute. Tribute is basically a tax where if they don't pay it, then whoever like beat the crap out of them in the first place and force them to pay tribute is going to come and, give them a little bit of a visit. And they'll just beat the living crap out of them again and then up the tribute. So it's kind of like tax for, losing pretty much. And again, even though politically these guys just seem to not quite have their stuff together, economically, we have local and not long distance trade on a very big scale. Now, the trade is going to be varied. And the trade will include slaves, many which are going to be intended for sacrifice. Trade would be, or the slaves rather that were traded, would be those that were taken in conquest. There isn't going to be a racial component to it, unlike with the Atlantic slave trade. And human sacrifice here is going to be much more prominent within this empire than in early empires of Mesoamerica, like, for example, the Incans. And this is going to be credited with crystallizing the ideology of the state and giving human sacrifice such huge importance. And in fact, to kind of like give you an idea, and you want to put this down here next to B here underneath number 4, just put it, somewhere in through here. Do you want to put, please, here that human sacrifice was seen as necessary for the survival of the Aztec kingdom? Human sacrifice was seen as necessary for survival of the Aztec kingdom. What they ended up doing is they created an important philosophical poetic tradition to focus on. And it's really sort of kind of a cool story that you have this Aztec god who every night goes and does battle with the forces of evil. And if the Aztec god is successful, then the sun comes up. However, the Aztec god is drained of his life force in this nightly battle. So, in order to assure that the Aztec god is going to be successful, you have to give him basically an equivalent of an Aztec Red Bull. You have to restore his life force, and the way that that is done is through the spilling of a blood sacrifice, is where a human sacrifice specifically comes in. Where if the sacrifice isn't given, then the Aztec god goes into battle at night and he'll be destroyed, he'll be vanquished. And if that's the case, then the sun never comes up and the Aztec Empire will be destroyed, will just simply cease to exist. So you have a tying in of these human sacrifices and religion into the preservation of the Aztec state. The other empire that's in the Americas is going to be the Incas. And for me, and this is just completely totally a personal opinion, the Incas just seem to have their stuff together a little bit more. The Incan Empire will be established by Quechua speakers that establishes the Incan Empire along the length of the Andes. Quechua, by the way, is still spoken in Peru as well, and other parts of what previously had been the Incan Empire. And this empire was big. I mean, not only in size, where it's 2,500 miles long, but it also has around 10 million subjects. Again, it is on a much larger scale than the Aztecs. And I think that's one of the things that really causes the Incans to be forced to have a stable bureaucracy, to have a stable political system, because you have an empire that stretched over really complicated terrain, thousands of miles, but then you also have a population of more than 10 million, nearly double what the Aztecs have. And if you can't get your stuff together, you're not going to be able to maintain this empire at all. And in general, like I said, the Incan Empire was far more bureaucratic and centralized than the Aztecs. The emperor was an absolute ruler and also regarded as divine, so it means that the Aztec ruler was also seen as a god. And theoretically, the state owns all of the land and resources. And it is highly organized. It's organized in around 80 provinces. Each of these provinces has its own Incan governor. So again, there's an internal state structure, there's an internal bureaucracy. And then within those provinces, subjects are grouped into hierarchical units of people, at least within the central regions. I mean, the more distant regions, it's going to be a little, shall we say, kind of fast and loose, but that's going to be for two reasons. One, there tends to be fewer people, so there's fewer need for a bureaucracy. And two, logistically, it's at a more substantial distance from the centralized government. So their control is going to be um, a little less strict because the Incans are going to be such a larger empire and is actually going to be made up of multiple groups of people, the Incans are going to attempt cultural integration. And the reason for this, I just said, but I need you to put it down here. Next to number 3, it's a small note, so you can probably fit it over here, just to the right there. Just want to put down that the empire was multicultural. The empire was multicultural. I mean, everyone is going to have to learn Quechua, especially the leaders of these various groups that were conquered. We're also going to take the leaders' sons and force them to move to, an Incan capital. Um, the subjects had to acknowledge the Incan gods. So there is this kind of, forced conversion, like trying to make these non-Quechua speakers, so these non quote unquote Incans, as Incan as they possibly can. Now, there are also some unique things to the Incan Empire, and the most unique is that almost everyone had to perform a labor service or the mita for the Incan state. Now, I know what you're thinking, that, oh, this is communism, that type of stuff. But really, what this is, you want to put this down here next to number 4. Do you want to put down here that Incans have a far more centralized have a far more centralized command type of system.
Now, what the meta is pretty straightforward. People had to work on state farms, herd, mining, military service, state construction. They could also produce goods for the state. And in exchange for this, the state would provide elaborate feasts because the Incans really kind of saw their survival as really kind of a team effort. And again, a lot of this is because the Incan Empire was multicultural. So get everybody involved in the preservation of the state. So everybody seems and gets a sensation that they are all part of this one larger team. Now, there is a commonality here between both the Incan and Aztec civilizations. Both are going to practice something known as gender parallelism, where women and men are going to operate in separate but equivalent spheres. And part of this is going to be parallel religious cults for women and men, where men will have their gods and women will have their goddesses, where for men, the highest god, at least on earth, is going to be the emperor, and for women, it's going to be the empress. There's also parallel hierarchies for female and male political officials, especially among the Incans. And here's the thing, because of this gender parallelism, women's household tasks are not regarded as inferior. In fact, in some ways, and this is a little note here I want you to put down next to D, underneath number 5. Again, it's a small note. You can probably fit it over here on the right-hand margin. Do you want to put down here that some household tasks were sacred. Some household tasks were sacred. Like, for example, sweeping. Typically seen as a quote-unquote woman's task, but the sweeping was symbolic of getting rid of bad spirits, getting rid of evil spirits, kind of pushing them out of the house. So rather than this being seen as some type of menial woman's task, it instead was seen as having religious significance. Even though we have this gender parallelism, still men had the top positions in political and religious life. And probably what undermined this was glorification of the military. And you want to put down here next to F, put a little star next to that here as well.